how many of you have ever had a concussion? Anybody in here?
I don't remember it.
How many of you
Sure.
have ever known somebody who's had a concussion, like a child or anybody else? And last of all, how many of you have heard about all the news on concussions in kids lately and wonder what all the hubbub is about? Nobody? So here's the deal. I've been a physical therapist for 37 years. I've worked with kids with learning differences, developmental disabilities, all different kinds of aspects of sensory motor challenges. And when you have a concussion, it throws you back into this sort of sensory motor crisis. So we have a lot of overlap in individuals with concussions and developmental therapy and sensory integration therapy in particular. So it was a natural combination when all of the information on concussions really began to hit the news that these are kids that we've been treating all along, and we began to really see the patterns especially with learning, behavior, developmental issues in relationship to concussions. So it's a very rapidly evolving field. There's a lot we know. I've been involved in a study working with ex-NFL players for the last couple of years, and we just published that study this year in the Journal of Acupuncture, which is out of Harvard. And it really kind of brings to light that there are treatments, too, that we can use to help people with concussions, even if they've had multiple injuries, like an NFL player, over a lot of time, in our military as well. We see a lot of benefit from certain kinds of treatments. So what I want to kind of go through today, and I'm going to try and do it quickly because I know you're eating lunch and we have about 20 minutes, but I want to share with you, how to identify a concussion. If you've got kids or grandkids that you're watching on the field, surely you've watched somebody get hit hard. And when do you worry? When are you an advocate for your child, and what are your kids' teams, coaches, and members doing about concussions when they occur? Are they well educated on what to look for, who to send them to? What's happening with these kids? Because the biggest issue is if you get concussed, there are things you can do to help prevent long-term injury. And it's the kids who don't get that kind of treatment, and even adults, but kids are a lot more susceptible, and I'll tell you why. Those are the ones that we start seeing things show up later. And hopefully this will make a little bit more sense to you as we go along. So anyway, here's kind of one of the problems that we're faced with in physical therapy and occupational therapy and rehab in particular, is that there's this big disconnect. I'm a mother of two boys, one who is now 26, the other one is 30, and one played football, one played rugby. And even when I was watching them in their games when they were in high school, my younger son, I watched him he was the rugby player, he got a bad concussion. Nobody noticed. He said afterwards, I think I got a concussion, I'm feeling kind of funny. His dad was a doctor, and, even that was 10 years ago, people just kind of blew it off. We hear about people getting concussions all the time, and nobody really would take it that seriously. Same thing with my older son who was playing football. I saw him get a really bad hit in the jaw. He never even complained. He was one of those kids who would just brush it off no matter what. And he later went on to join the military, and now we have to worry about all the blast injuries that are also causes of concussion. So it's this disconnect that we've had over the years where we now kind of have this culture clash of what do we do about football and the controversy of young kids playing football, and why shouldn't they do that? And we have sports are so good for our developing body. They're so good for our kids, and in so many different ways. But how can we set them up for success so that they can get all the benefits out of organized sport without putting them at risk? Because I don't think any parent intentionally wants to put their child in a risky position. But we now have this evidence that supports that there are things, that we need to be aware of, and people really do need to take it seriously. And it's really all of our responsibility to to be shepherds of our children and make sure that they're in safe situations and get the right kind of help if they do need it. So, unfortunately, brains don't heal the way bones do. We see a bone, we can measure it, and I'll talk more about this, but it takes, even in a mild concussion, it takes the brain 3 to 4 weeks to recover. So when you've had a concussion and the doctor clears the kid to go back to play in a week, just know their brain is not fully recovered yet. And they're at a really vulnerable period for those next 3 to 4 weeks. And it's, again, what you don't know until, we now, know things. There's a need for greater awareness on everybody's side, even the physicians. We deal with pediatricians who haven't had extra training in concussion rehab yet. So, unless they have a real good understanding of what the whole sequelae afterwards is, there can be a tendency for even a physician to blow it off. Here's an example. I'm also a grandmother, and my little grandson, when he was about 2, he fell out of bed at night, and his parents have the baby monitor and everything, and they heard this huge thump, and he was crying and, everything that you might imagine from a child falling out of the bed. And they went in there, and finally he settled down, and he went to bed. But the next day, he was watching his little Porky Pig video or something on the iPad, which he really shouldn't have been doing anyway because he's 2. You don't want to do that when they're that young. But he started having what looked like seizures. And they filmed it and they sent it to me, and he was having these focal seizures when he was watching this iPad, because there's a blue light that goes off from an iPad and it flickers very fast, and it will elicit a seizure if that potential is there. So I immediately got on the phone and got him in to see a neurologist. He went to see the neurologist, and the neurologist told them, I wouldn't worry about it. He didn't throw up, and he didn't lose consciousness. Those are the two things. You don't have to lose consciousness to have a concussion, and you don't have to throw up to have a concussion. But he was indeed having these little seizures, and they eventually went away, but they had to really watch him, because again, that 3 to 4 weeks after that event, it's usually not the first concussion that will get you, it's the other ones that come afterwards. And that's where you really have to be careful, and why there's all this, looking at identifying kids on the field and pulling them from the game and not taking a chance by putting them back in, because many of them will be asymptomatic at the time of a hit. So underreporting ends up being a major problem. Parents are getting, increased awareness, but still don't really have all the information. So it's kind of like, well, what do I do now? You had a concussion. Your coach might have given you a piece of paper that said to go see this doctor, and when they clear you, you can come back. But that's all the information, for the most part, and that's beginning to change. But they're not really getting the full picture. The other thing is that kids really are often not followed. So they'll have a concussion. People will keep them low-key for a little while, or they won't. They'll either do too much or too little, and then it's the stuff that happens later that starts showing up, sometimes weeks or even months later, that can be a result of these previous injuries. So here's what happens when you have a concussion. It can be anything. You don't even have to hit your head. You can hit your tailbone, but it's a jarring of the skull and of the head. So the brain contents, especially in children, they have a lot more movement within the skull. So any kind of a force causes the brain contents to actually hit against the skull and then rebound. You can imagine, in a car accident, a whiplash scenario, or falling off a bike where you have a height, or even some of our kids in high school who play football, and the false sense of security that many of them have because they have all this padding, they have a helmet. We think that helmets protect your brain. They don't. They protect you from a skull fracture. They do not protect you from a concussion. And this brain content is getting these jolts in there. When that happens, you release there's different chemical reactions that happen with sodium and potassium in particular. So you get this kind of chemical cascade that's really the damaging factor to the brain. It's almost as if you had these little filaments that go together, and with each hit, they kind of break apart a little bit. So again, the first one, maybe you broke apart that much, it's not a big deal, but the next one, you broke more, and the next one, so you begin to get these disconnects. And that's what they're finding with these players who have CTE. It's all this tau protein that's built up in the brain from all these disconnections over time. You could also think of it like a snow globe. Take the little cells in your brain and shake it up, and it takes a while for those things to settle back down again. And that's where, you're looking at a couple of weeks before you actually are fully recovered. This is the other thing, think about ice hockey, all the sports where somebody lands on their tailbone. Has anybody ever had a bad fall on their tailbone? Did you get a headache afterwards? Many times you will, because it's all connected. So your tailbone and your head, and you got this dural tube that runs up and down your spinal cord. If you hit your tailbone really hard, you can have a shock all the way up to your head that can affect you and have long-term sequelae as a result. So because of all this other stuff, kids and adolescents in particular, and when we talk about kids being more vulnerable to injury, we're talking age 23 and younger, that it is very typical for kids to have multiple injuries before anybody really notices that there might be a problem, if they notice it at all. A lot of the kids that we see for learning differences in grammar school and all the way up through high school, if you look at their history, many of them will have had a history of concussion. And you wonder, is that just the way they were in the first place, or is it a result of that injury? We also know that kids with learning differences, if they do get a concussion, they have more of a tendency to have prolonged effects as a result. Or you could have a child with a learning difference that was not diagnosed, and then they have a concussion, and these learning differences begin to emerge afterwards. So it's really, interesting in how, there is this connection, and it is something that we want to take seriously. So, we talk about kids being under the age of 18. It's really 23 and younger. But the younger the child, the greater the impact on the central nervous system. So if you have first, second, and third graders playing contact football, there's a lot of controversy about that today, there's just no reason for it. There really isn't. They should be playing a different game that does not involve actual contact, physical contact. And that will change eventually. But again, it's this big cultural shift that we're having to go through with some of our contact sports. And already girls soccer is picking it up where under a certain age you're not allowed to head the ball, but they still do. And we now know that all these headers over time can be just as damaging, especially in a younger child when they do have a lot of them, because the same thing, it's a force that goes into the head. And as you get into high school, that force is a fast ball. We have a lot of girls. Probably the most kids that we see in our clinic are girls soccer, because of all the headers and just where their awareness is and the tendency to get blindsided. Early recognition again and proper treatment is the key. So what are the signs? You see somebody get hit, on the field. What are the things that you should be aware of that might happen? Dizziness is the number one. If somebody is dizzy, that's kind of the number one sign of a protracted recovery. Dizziness is not good to see. If you had dizziness, you have a concussion. Light sensitivity, headaches that can show up. Not just a lot of times they'll have a concussion. These kids say they're fine. They want to keep playing. There's a lot of peer pressure. They are a tough group to work with because they're competitive. They don't want to leave their friends. They're in it. Their parents are in it. We want to win, and all this stuff. But, over time, then they wake up the next day and they're having headaches. And then, you're wondering what went on. But at the time, they may not experience any of this, or at least not be aware of it or admit to it. Amnesia, that could be amnesia where you didn't remember anything after the hit, or it could be amnesia if you didn't remember anything before the hit. For my son, the rugby player, he said he didn't realize he really had a concussion until the next day when he went and they were reviewing their plays on the video, and he saw himself get the concussion. And then afterwards, he went on to score 2 tries, and they won the game. He had no recollection at all of his tries. I mean, he was working through that game in total autopilot, had no memory of it at all, which is pretty scary, especially now knowing what I know, looking back, thinking, oh gosh. Ringing in the ears, that's where that whole got your bell rung thing comes from. Impaired balance. When you see somebody get injured on the field, you don't ever want to see somebody helping them up off the field. They really need to get up on their own. That's part of the evaluation process. And a lot of times, people want to run out there and help somebody up. We got to see if they're dizzy or not. Because if they have a hard time getting up and they're kind of stumbling around for a little bit, that's a red flag that there's been an injury going on there. Nausea and vomiting doesn't have to occur, but it can occur. And then neck and head pain. We see a lot of kids, a lot of adults too, from after having a concussion, they've got a lot of what we call cervicogenic issues or trouble with the neck. And a lot of their symptoms, the headaches, the fuzzy thinking, some of the other stuff that comes later, is a result of their neck being injured, and we have to treat the neck rather than the head. So there's a very detailed evaluation process that goes into what is it that's causing all these symptoms? What's causing the dizziness? Is it the vestibular system in the ears, or is it how the eyes and the ears match up? What's causing the trouble thinking in school or the grades dropping? Is it because their eyes aren't teaming well? And then we need to do vision therapy and work at strengthening the eyes. And then with the neck, they're walking down the hallway in school, and they've got all this stuff going on, and they're trying, every time they turn, they get disoriented, and now they're dizzy, and we don't know what's going on until we evaluate the neck. So there's lots of different things that can cause these symptoms, and having a good physical therapist or somebody who's really highly specialized in concussion recovery is sort of your key to teasing out what are the things that is causing the symptoms. These are obviously, you see any of these things, you call 911. It's an emergency kind of situation. Nausea and vomiting, not just by itself, but with some of these other things. If you notice any blood or fluid coming from the nose or the ears, we want to pay attention, is there cerebral spinal fluid in that? So there's something called a halo effect if they have a bloody nose or a bloody ear or they're bleeding. If you see on clothing or sheet or whatever they're laying on, a clear circle around that bloody spot, that can be cerebral spinal fluid. You can see cerebral spinal fluid leaking from the ears or from the nose. If you have a lot of clear or yellowish liquid coming out of the ears or nose, that could be cerebral spinal fluid. So that signals that there is a rupture in your central nervous system. That's very, very serious. With kids, there's another thing that's only particular to children, not adults, and it's called second impact syndrome. And it's where it's so dangerous to put a kid back in the game after they've been hit, especially if they've had any of these signs at all. Because again, the first concussion isn't what usually really hurts you, it's that second one. And with that second concussion, if they do have a second concussion, especially within the next 2 to 3 weeks after that injury, then if it's bad enough, there can be sudden death attached, and it has to do with the cerebral spinal fluid. So it doesn't happen very often, but it happens enough to the parents who had to go through this. So it is serious. It's not just a matter of winning the game. It really is that we want people who are looking after our kids to keep them safe. Immediate bruising or swelling, any kind of profuse bleeding, obviously, seizures, impaired vision, altered breathing, anything that just doesn't seem quite right and is in the extreme, call 911. Other things just to know, to be aware of, I already talked about the helmets. They protect your skull. They don't protect your brain from concussions. There's a mouth guard. A lot of the kids wear mouth guards that are on the top. There's now this mouth guard. It's called Power Plus. And I brought you mine, the one that they made for me. But it goes on the bottom, like that. I won't put it on. And what it does is it puts your TMJ in a neutral position that actually helps. It kind of works as a shock absorber, sort of like a steering column in a car, so that when you drive down the road, you're not, bouncing all over the place. This kind of helps cushion the brain a little bit more. And there's a dentist in Minnesota who developed it, or an orthodontist, and I'm glad that it's actually getting a lot more recognition in getting out there so that people are more aware of it. They're like $35, so anything that's going to help keep somebody safer is a good idea. You don't have to be knocked unconscious. We talked about that. In fact, sometimes being unconscious is almost neuroprotective, because it's the brain, it's getting a reboot. It's shutting down and then it reboots. Whereas, if you are still conscious and you're fighting through it, that can actually have more of a tendency to have longer symptoms afterwards than somebody who lost consciousness. Not that if you lose consciousness, that's not significant. And then the dizziness is the number one predictor of a prolonged recovery. After somebody is suspected of having a concussion on the field, they need to be removed from the field, even if they get up on their own, and they need to sit out. The only way you can evaluate somebody is to do sequential evaluations. It's not just when they get up off the field. 9 times out of 10, those kids are going to say they're okay. I can't tell you how many children I see in my clinic, who, especially girls in high school who play soccer, who will say, I told him it was okay. I felt fine right afterwards, and so they let me play. And then, they end up with, a much more serious injury. But it was because they really wanted to play and nobody wanted to say no. And so they have to have these sequential evaluations to really see is, in 5 minutes after the event, do they have any symptoms? 10 minutes after the event, do they have any symptoms? And then go from there. They have coaches should have a whole protocol in place for how to evaluate their players afterwards. And unfortunately, a lot of the select teams, they do not have that in place. But all the public high schools and public sports are required by law to. So if your kids play in select sports and stuff, talk to your coaches about getting somebody who who can play that role on your team. If you suspect a concussion, that saying if in doubt, sit them out. It's a good one to follow. Most concussions, fortunately, will heal on their own, but again, it takes 3 to 5 weeks. The average being 4 to 5 weeks to heal. So know that during that period of time, that child or adult is very vulnerable, and we do not want to set them up for this second impact syndrome or another injury. One thing that we also know is that there's a higher risk of lower extremity injuries right after a concussion because your balance reactions are all off for a couple of weeks. So if they're playing 2 weeks later and they haven't been fully evaluated or treated and their reaction time isn't known to be 100%, then it's very easy to twist your ankle, blow out your Achilles, do something to your knee, any of these things. And those kids are probably lucky when they ended up with their lower extremity injury because now they can't play. And so now they're being forced to sit out, let their brains heal, but they also have a lower extremity injury to deal with. So, and last, a concussion, just to know, it changes the function of the brain. It doesn't change the structure of it. So many people say, well, I got an MRI and it was fine. Or I got a CAT scan and it was fine. I got an x-ray, it was fine. Those things do not diagnose a concussion. That just tells us, is the skull fractured or is there a bleed? That's it. So a concussion happens much more frequently and it is not diagnosed by advanced imaging. It's the electrical and chemical changes that take the brain to recover. And because of that, you can have symptoms that show up later. Many times, the first week or 2 or 3, kids or adults might complain of headaches, trouble thinking, foggy thinking, stuff like that. But there's also kids and adults who a month later, 2 months later, 6 months later are still having symptoms that are not quite resolving. And your body tries to accommodate for these, and they may accommodate for them, but you pay a price on your body overall. And we can see how the eyes are functioning and the vestibular is functioning to actually identify concussions that happened years ago. So it's really never too late to look at these things and address them, especially if they're getting in the way of your function, or you have a history of headaches, or trouble thinking, or any of the other things that can go along with it. And having a concussion specialist early really can help with those, sort those things out. Post-concussive syndrome is important just to mention, because that's this delayed recovery. So who's at risk for these delayed recoveries? If most people heal within 3 to 5 weeks, which is great, we need to kind of be really keeping an eye out for those 3 to 5 weeks. Okay, if they do too much or they do too little, then that can set them up for having this prolonged recovery. If a child cannot go to school all day without any symptoms, they cannot play sports. They are not. School cognitive work is just as physically demanding on the brain as athletics. So, again, it's amazing how many people think, well, he's staying home from school till noon so he can play in the afternoon. It doesn't work like that. It's all equal. Anything that brings up symptoms, you don't do for that recovery period. You've got to have that just right challenge to get the brain so that it can heal totally before you go back out and play. Some of the risk factors that are associated with this post-concussive syndrome, that's any symptoms that last longer than 6 weeks, history of learning differences. Those kids tend to have a harder time recovering over time. A history of migraines. We see more girls than boys actually with prolonged symptoms, but if they've had a history of migraines, that can be a big red flag. A history of previous concussions. The rule of thumb is if you've had 3 concussions and you're in sports in high school, you're done playing. They don't want you back out there playing. 3 is your max, and it's because of this accumulative effect. And there's really a lot of evidence to support that. Does that happen? Not as often as it probably should. So again, if you have a bad concussion as your first one, let's get it 100% healed before somebody gets back out there, because if they get a second one, they're going to be much worse off if that first one hasn't healed. And then if they get a third one, they're done. So if we want our kids to really enjoy a lifetime of sports in safety, then we want to make sure they're healing completely before we put them back into that kind of harm's way. A history of depression, and then under the age of 23. How many of you have an unruly teenager in your house? Anybody in this? So, I tell you, we see it on the news and everything, these, tragic events that happen in high school. And again, if you look back at their history and what was in their history, what set somebody up for stuff like that, we have to start wondering, is there an underlying brain injury, to somebody to be so irrational? We found out from Ernie Hernandez, he had the worst case of CTE ever. He was the football player who committed suicide in jail. And nobody, and he was young. He was like, what was he, 23, something like that? 23, he was 26. So yeah, but he was young, but he started playing football very young. And all these NFL players that I've worked with who've had a lot of these symptoms, they all started playing football when they were kids. A lot of them played Prop Warner and, were out there having these multiple hits when they were very, very young. So, things looking at, depression, the irritability, the learning differences, the slip in the grades, the decrease in judgment, all the stuff that, many teenagers do go through. If they have any of this history in their past, just keep it in mind and maybe seek out some kind of help or evaluation to see, is this playing a part in that, because it gets missed and misinterpreted. The signs that can show up later: hard to study, decreased concentration, tired, irritable. Irritability is a big one. They lose interest. They stop playing football. They stop playing, wanting to hang out with their friends. They lose interest in all these other outside activities, become more introverted. Poor sleep, foggy thinking. That's something I hear from adults a lot, and as well as kids. Kids just say, it's just hard for me to concentrate. But adults say, I just feel foggy. I feel like I'm seeing through the fog. They just don't feel right. And then kids, over time, over semester, if you start seeing their grades dropping, that's a sign that, there could be something that's interfering with their vision, how they're processing information, and it's treatable. We can treat these things, if they're there. So it's worth looking at. The collateral damage in athletics, the reaction times are off. That's why you have a higher incidence of having a secondary injury. So here is a study that showed the risk of a second concussion soon after the first. You are 4 times more susceptible to sustaining another concussion after that one, and 3 times more likely to sustain it in the same season. With the lower extremity leg things, it's because of all those reaction times that are off and can affect you. So I think I'm doing okay on time, am I?
We've got a couple more minutes
okay.
to take some questions. I was just going to make a comment. Troy Aikman recently came out and said that if he had any boys, he would discourage them from playing football. Yeah.
He's smart. There's a lot of football players who are saying that.
So what do we do to the recovery?
So I'm going to do this really fast so okay? You suspect a concussion. The rule of thumb, complete rest for 2 to 3 days, no more than that. Then you're going to go by symptoms only. Anything that elicits a symptom. So first day, it's kind of like if you have the flu, you don't feel very good, but you get up and you walk to the kitchen, you get some water, and you walk back to your bed. And if that makes you feel worse, then you stay in bed and have somebody bring something to you. But if you feel okay doing that, you want to increase your tolerance. But you want to stay within the symptom-free zone. No headaches, no elicit of other symptoms. No screen time. That means cell phones, computers, TV, stuff like that. Especially if it brings on any symptoms. But that first 2 to 3 days, they really just need their brains to rest.
They're in prison.
Yeah, they are. But you don't want to stick them in a dark room and say you can't move, because then you get other things. But you do have to just kind of create a protective cocoon space within your home, so that they're not pushing into things. Immediately after a concussion, no sports drinks. First thing people do is they take them a Gatorade or a Powerade. You've got all these electrolytes in there and you're in a metabolic crisis. If you add electrolytes at that time, you're making things worse. So water, just lots of water. No caffeine. So, Coca-Colas, stuff like that, no good. Dr. Pepper's, no good. No alcohol. That's easy for us to say. These kids should not be going to, parties in their recovery phase, especially if they're, even if they say they're not drinking, it happens. No milk, ice cream, or milkshakes, because of the milk protein, again, because of this metabolic crisis. And no aspirin, only Tylenol. And that just, again, because you've got this very, kind of protective thing going on where your brain is trying very hard to balance itself. Just the Tylenol is really, yeah. Minimal sugar, that's kind of a big thing. You want to be as ketogenic as possible, so protein is really good. Give them a steak dinner or omega-3s, also really good. Avocados, halibut, cod, nuts, fats, coconut oil, any of those kinds of things are very healing to the brain. A baseline test, this is just something you can do ahead of time before your child plays sports, so you get a good measure of where they are before they play. That gives us a benchmark back. Should they get injured, you want to make sure they're 100%. That's going to tell you if they are. It's also going to identify any risk factors like peripheral vision blocks or anything that you can treat ahead of time and set them up for safety on the field and be a better athlete. And then there's all these different things that we can do in treatment, again, depending on what are the things that show up. So there are options for treatment, whether it's from that initial baseline test that you see some weaknesses that you can shore up or after an injury, but it's pairing the individual with the right treatment. Too many times you go to an athletic trainer, all they treat it with is exercise. If you've got a visual problem or you've got a vestibular problem, then you need a different kind of therapy, on top of that. So we've got lots of different things to look at. We have one thing in particular, the craniosacral therapy really helps to rest the brain. So we're seeing great benefits from that. And that was what our study was with the NFL players. Just using that tool, that craniosacral therapy, to help maximize their brain function. So there is a lot of good stuff out there and available, and I hope you learned something new today. But that kind of sums it up. I think criteria for return to play. One more. You want to hear this? Okay. You have to be cleared by a healthcare provider. So you got that. Your doctor says it's okay. But what does that mean? They need to be checked. They need to have normal neurologic function. So that doctor better be doing more than just saying, okay, you're okay if the child says they feel good. Normal balance, free of headaches, free of dizziness, free of seizures, free of fatigue. They need to follow a return to play protocol. You don't just go back out and play, but there should be a protocol in place that gets their endurance back up to where they were. And if the symptoms return, then they need to be referred back to the concussion specialist. They need to be in school full time before they're playing sports. If they're getting symptoms at school, they're not ready to be playing in sports. So that, I think, is it. So there you go. But does anybody have any questions about? Yeah.
There's been some alluding to people who have had concussions are more prone to developing organic brain disease in later life.
Right.
Alzheimer's, something.
That's the CTE that we're talking about, the chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that is very prevalent in the football players in particular. But there are a lot of neurodegenerative diseases. Parkinson's is another one. We see a lot of Parkinson's with the result of multiple head injuries. You think about the boxing world, and all the boxers have a lot of Parkinson's. So, there's in brain research, there's so much going on. Everybody's looking at, what are the effects of these sports on the brain. There are not as many people looking at, okay, what can we do about it? And we, have lots of good evidence for vestibular rehab, vision rehab, the craniosacral therapy now, and even the exercise tolerance and how you progress that, to be able to recover fully. So.
Yeah, we are running out of time, and I would like to ask Sally to stay a little bit longer if anyone would like to ask her
any questions.
And thank you very much for being here today. And as a token of our appreciation, please accept the East Dallas Rotary coffee mug so you can have a warm coffee during your interpretation, reading, and everything. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That's nice.